From those beginnings, of course, the manip therapists went on to more and more onerous exams. There were questions that some people asked, who examines the examiners? It was Ace Neame, Ian Searle, Robin McKenzie and Brian Mulligan, of course, did most of the clinical work. Ace and Ian did a lot of the clinical teaching as well. And then we came up with this examination process, and I recall both times I had to reset to qualify. I think I was number 29 on their register. And it was an onerous, very onerous exam, and quite a few people fell by the wayside and asked the question, who examines the examiner? What gives them the right to set that standard or to ask those questions or to determine that you can or can't be on that particular register or qualification? Probably valid questions in reality. But then if you ask yourself the other question, what would happen if they said, well, it's not us, and did nothing? Then, we'd still have people who maybe learnt a few techniques from somebody else on somewhere or whatever, maybe went to their clinic for a morning and watched them do a few things, and you would never have progressed. So, despite the validity of that question, the fact that it was done, people took the responsibility, took that bull by the horn. And it was the same in the acupuncture group. People went off, some went to China and did courses. Were they good courses? Were they bad courses? Who knows? They were courses, they came back and knew a heck of a lot more than we did, is the bottom line. And from that, of course, develops, and the whole standard of the profession, then you start bringing in outside experts for seminars, for courses, conferences, who do workshops subsequently. And that is what builds the fabric of your academic and practical knowledge in the background. So I think the frontiers people in those days did a wonderful job. In acupuncture, Di Turnbull and Mike Anderson, Dr. Mike Anderson, were the forerunners in the physiotherapy acupuncture group and pushed it along. And did wonderful things to create the program that is now in existence and is actually being taken over into the professional teaching establishments, both here at the AUT and in Otago. And talking of the acupuncture reminds me actually of the very early days. There was a chap in Wellington. What the heck was his name? Young. Anyway, again, that name will come to me, who was castigated by the profession, and I do recall because I just started on the executive in those days, for advertising acupuncture and doing something that wasn't physiotherapy. So he was castigated on two accounts. One, he was advertising, which he wasn't allowed to, as I remarked before. And number two, he was doing something as outlandish as acupuncture. Ray Young was his name, got it. Within, I think it was 3 years, Ray Young also ran a few courses. Do you want to take that? Yep. So Ray Young had been, as I say, castigated for these contraventions of our requirements, but they couldn't actually hang him on anything because his advertising was for acupuncture, and whilst acupuncture wasn't part of physiotherapy, it didn't say you couldn't do it. So that was the end of that. But within 3 years, because he had been doing a few weekend courses for other like-minded people, physiotherapists, there was a small cohort of physiotherapists around the country who had this interest and were practicing a little bit of acupuncture. And from that, somebody, Graham Hayhow and Doug Edwards had a practice in Newmarket, And they had contacts in Sydney with the Australian Physiotherapy Association, and these guys did acupuncture courses over there, and acupuncture in Australia was much further ahead than it was in New Zealand. So through them, they arranged a Module 1 that was called course in Sydney, to which about 18 or so of physiotherapists from New Zealand went. Most of us with absolutely no concept of acupuncture or what had done, never touched a needle. But of course we had been playing around with a bit of TENS at those days, which had just been coming through. Ian Searle had brought through his stimulator box and so forth. So we were starting to get into this concept of pain modulation. Melzack and Wall, of course, were there with their were part of the world scene at that stage with their gate theory of pain coming through and so on. So it was all, the stars were aligning themselves, shall we say. So we went off to Sydney and again had more social times, but they're best left alone. But during the day we had this fairly traditionally orientated course for about 5 or 6 days on acupuncture, basic acupuncture. And we all came home again and we got our needles that we'd bought and we practiced a bit of acupuncture, and funnily enough a few people seemed to actually get better, so you got a little bit more enthusiastic. They repeated the module for another group the following year, and about another 18 people went over. And then later that year they did a module 2, a slightly more advanced course, and I think about 16 of us from the 2 module 1 groups went over and did this sort of slightly more advanced course in acupuncture. So by then you had a group of 30, 40 people in New Zealand who were using acupuncture, albeit in a fairly rudimentary way in those days. And the thought was, well, this is fine, but we really need to organise this a bit better. So we called a meeting in the 4th floor lecture theatre at Auckland Public Hospital, 1981. That would have been about 1982. I'd have to look at the minutes to be positive about that. And I guess there were about 30 or 40 people in this arena. And it was agreed that we would organise, convene a body called the Physiotherapy, Acupuncture and Pain Modulation Association, PAPMA, it was called in those days. It was felt that the term pain modulation needed to be put in there, not just acupuncture, because of all the pain modulation business that was going on with electronic type of pain modulation. TENS and I think interferential was starting to come in and so forth. So it was felt prudent to keep the name as wide and as encompassing as possible. And I finished up being the secretary of that body, so it was up to me then to get that one sort of administratively up and running. But guess who was the chairperson of that of that inaugural body? Ray Young from Wellington, who 3 years before had been castigated for doing acupuncture, was now the inaugural president of the Physiotherapy Acupuncture Association. So that was how quickly the worm turned on that particular situation. Quite telling, and it's nice to recognise the fact that professionals could see when it was time for a change. And the Acupuncture Association then grew and grew and grew. It started running its own modules here in New Zealand. Dr. Mike Anderson became very much a supporter and a promoter of physiotherapy and acupuncture. And with Di Turnbull, they really were the powerhouse academically and clinically, technically in those early days. Subsequently, it was felt that the name of the body of the special interest group should change, and I think it's just the Physiotherapy Acupuncture New Zealand group now, PANS. And the courses became more and more organised and more streamlined, and with a structure, with a progression of quantity and quality and technicality associated to it. Exams were introduced, and levels were constantly being upgraded. I attended the World Confederation of Physiotherapy, or Physical Therapy, in London. That was 1990. It was a year after the one after Sydney. Must have been about 92 or 3, whatever it was, or no, anyway, around there. And there was a couple of people in England who were pushing acupuncture in the English physiotherapy world, and they organised a meeting of like-minded international people, which I attended, and we agreed then to have an international physiotherapy body, and I finished up being the vice president of that one. Our organisation, as I reported it to this international group, was so far ahead of anybody else's. South Africa was there, Charles Liggins, I think he's still the editor of their newsletter. The Australians were there, and so forth. So that was where the International Physiotherapy, IAPT, International Acupuncture Association of Physical Therapists, came into being. And I see now that how the New Zealand involvement continues at a very high level with, I think the chairperson is still a New Zealander, or was it the vice president, whatever. We're still highly involved there. So that's great to see that these bodies that we get involved with continue and grow and do their thing. So that was really the background to the acupuncture side of it and my practice, and I, of course, brought more and more acupuncture into my own work. It helped my thumbs and fingers and wrists, which are pretty shot anyway, but maybe it lasted a bit longer than I might have using the acupuncture. Again, exciting times, those. Bringing in a completely new technique, something that a lot of people scoffed at and didn't recognise or thought you were woolly in the head or whatever. But with the clinical side being split down, the traditional pathway, which works, and the increasingly scientific Western pathway, and you get the Scandinavians and Thomas Lundberg and so forth coming in with all the actual research, the hard science that dictates why it does work, and you can't argue that. And the Chinaman just latches on and with his explanations and so forth. And when you look at the two sides, you think the Chinaman actually had it right. He just used big, long, waffly words like yin and yang or whatever. But the actual application of the technique, you can explain both ways, and they both overlap. And that was always good too, because you could think this way if it worked for you technically, scientifically, dermatomes and scleroderms and neuroderms and every other dome that you want to think about. Or you can think about the yin and the yang and the co-cycle and so forth. And either way, you still come out at the same points and the same end result, which is good for the patient, of course. So that was really my involvement in acupuncture, and I must say again there, the Acupuncture Association appointed me as a life member, and for which, again, I have a great deal of pride in that, and recognise it, and do follow the ongoing involvement of people in the acupuncture world, and the fact the international side of it, which is always a measure of how strong you are in your own country, if you're also helping to lead the world, that your own country has got to be pretty healthy with that sort of involvement. So good on it from that perspective.